The Winter of Red Snow, The Revolutionary War Diary of Abigail Jane Stewart, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 1776. Reading 11. Monday, May 4th, 1778. This morning, while getting the laundry, we heard much excited talk in the kitchen and front room of headquarters. Mrs. Washington wore an apron over her cotton dress and was overseeing the baking of pies, gingerbread. A roast pig turned on the spit, its juice filling the drip pan. General Greene's wife and several other ladies were helping. The skirts filled the room with color and rustling. I glanced in the other room. General Washington stood by the hearth, his arm on the mantel. He was smiling and listening to his officers. "What has happened?" I said. I whispered to Billy Lee. "Oh, miss, the best news ever," he said. He nodded towards Pierre and Lafayette, who were surrounded by officers, clapping them on the backs and shaking their hands. Mrs. Washington leaned over to smile at us. Her sleeves were pushed up to the elbows, and there was flour on her chin. "It's an alliance with France, Abby. They are coming to help us fight the British. Praise God, we might be back in our own beds sooner than we think." That explained why Pierre and Lafayette were having affection lavished on them. They were no longer just aides de camp. They were now our allies. As Elizabeth and I carried the sacks down the hallway, we saw Mrs. Greene moving gracefully into the parlor, also to shake Pierre's hand, then Lafayette's. She spoke perfect French. By the time we were going out the door, we stood open for the breeze. She was a cheerful conversation with the two Frenchmen, Alexander Hamilton and another aide named John Lawrence. How I wish I could speak that pretty language, too. May 5th, 1778, Tuesday. 10 straight days of sunshine. Helen is so large with child she has trouble lying down at nights. Papa brought her a cot down by the fire and raised the back so she can sleep sitting up. She complains not, but I know she's glad she doesn't have to climb the stairs. Lucy's parents are sick with worry. They have come over twice this week. What am I to do? If I tell, Lucy shall feel betrayed, but if I keep her secret, is it proper to let her family suffer so? May 6th, 1778, Wednesday. What a grand day. It's late now, and I will try to put it all down before my candle goes. At dawn, we woke to a call of a fife and a single drummer. Such a beautiful morning, cool with sunshine. Birds have returned to the trees, making nests and songs. Finally, there are flowers. The slopes of Mount Joy and Mount Misery are purple and red with azaleas. Even the shade is bright with yellow from the blooming laurel. From 9 o'clock till 10:30, a hush fell over the valley. Everywhere soldiers with their officers knelt together in their brigades. Papa rode the outskirts of the camp and said the chaplains were leading the men in prayer and thanksgiving. Everyone is so humbly grateful for the French alliance. We could hear voices rise in the singing of hymns, like an echo rolling across the valley. It was a most joyful sound, and though I could hear no words, it filled me with peace. When the singing stopped, we climbed the hill to look down towards Varnum's quarters. There, in perfectly straight rows, the soldiers stood at attention. General Washington was on his gray horse, most dignified, flanked by his generals, all in sharp uniform. Papa explained this was an inspection. We watched Baron von Steuben give orders. Each brigade responded in perfect form, turning, marching, and kneeling to load their muskets. Azor, wearing his coat and sash, appeared nervous from the horses and guns. He ran off into the brush. Neighbors gathered to watch, and there were excited cries of children when 13 cannons, 6-pounders, were rolled up to the rear of Conway's brigade. General Washington gave a signal with a smooth wave of his hat. From the hill cannons began to fire, one after another, a 13-gun salute. It was so loud Johnny screwed up his face and would have not stopped crying. Sally held her hands over her ears. Papa raised his arm and cheered, and I found myself with tears. I know not why, but there was a beauty about the soldiers lined up, so proud and clean, the cannons firing for joy, not war. When the last echo from the last boom faded away, there began what Papa called a feu de joie. Now, one by one, muskets began to fire along the front rank from right to left, then down the second rank from left to right. The shots rippled back and forth, raising smoke like dozens of chimneys. The whole effect filled every one of us with excitement and joy and hope. This was our army, no longer weak or frightened or cold. This feu de joie truly was a fire of joy. When the soldiers and officers, hundreds and hundreds of them, burst into cheering, shouting, "Huzzah! Long live the King of France!" Mama covered her face with her apron and wept with happiness. My candle. Too short. May 7th, 1778, Thursday. To finish about yesterday. When the ranks of muskets had quieted, there began another 13-gun salute from the hill, followed by another feu de joie. Then the men again cheered. This time they shouted, "Long live the friendly European powers!" Then once more the 13 guns blasted, one after another, and once more the musket shot rippled through the ranks. Such smoke rose and filled the valley. But by now every neighbor, child, and soldier was cheering, and we heard the words, "Long live the American States." Johnny finally stopped crying, but he had hiccups and an unhappy face. Helen carried him into the house so he could settle down. Papa stood behind Mama with his arms around her as he watched the soldiers file out. General Washington rode towards headquarters on his beautiful horse, his arms waving his tricorn. We could not see his face, but we did hear him shout "Huzzah!" again and again. Papa said, "Darling, if ever our army was ready to stand up to the British, I believe it is now." We have just finished supper. The days are getting longer, and I'm writing by the last bits of sunlight. I can see headquarters. Our door downstairs is open for the cool night air, and we can hear laughter and singing. All afternoon, officers and their ladies rode up to attend Washington's celebrations. I wonder if Mrs. Washington baked enough pies. Papa said that after being allied with the French might help us shoo the redcoats out of America for good. May 8, 1778, Friday. Helen has been uncomfortable all day and unable to eat. Mama said this means her baby is ready to be born. Now it's late, nearly 10:30. Papa and Sally are sleeping, but Mama is downstairs with Helen. Every few minutes she cries out and then apologizes for crying. "It's all right, Helen, dear," Mama tells her. "Thou mayest cry as loud as you want." May 9th, 1778, Saturday. Before breakfast, Papa left with the wagon to get Mrs. Hughes. Poor Helen, she is exhausted. 2 p.m. Johnny and Sally are both having naps on the rug. There is sunshine on them from the side window. How they sleep through all our voices is a mystery. Mrs. Hughes soothes Helen with a wet cloth. Now she and Mama are making Helen get up and walk around. She is so tired she cries without tears. "Thou must not die," I whispered to myself. 5 p.m. Papa took Sally and Johnny to the Potters, where they shall stay the night. May 10th, 1778, Sunday. I am nearly too tired to write this, but Mama says there must be a record. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. The sun is not up yet. A baby girl was born 15 minutes ago. May 11th, 1778, Monday. We've all had some rest, and it is easier for me to write. Helen is sleeping in Mama's bed, her tiny daughter by her side. She has named her Olivia, and she is a beautiful pink with a crown of red hair. Now I remember her father, the poor soldier in the hut whose feet were cut off. He had red hair too, and the most gentle blue eyes. I sorrow that he's not alive to see his family. Mrs. Potter came by with a pot of stew and cupcakes. Mrs. Adams brought 3 apple pies. I knew not what to say when we opened the door and saw Mrs. Fitzgerald standing there with a basket on her arm. "For the new baby," she said. She turned and walked quickly down the road. We lifted the cloth. There inside was a small quilt, booties, and a rag doll with a pretty blue dress. May 12th, 1778, Tuesday. We are a day late going to the General's laundry, but Mama said sometimes that's the way things are. We have strung 2 lines outside between the trees and fence to let the sun do its quick work. It is much more pleasant to iron and fold with shirts that are such dry in the fresh air instead of a sooty house. Mama is teaching Helen how to nurse her baby and keep her clean and warm. I held Olivia and rocked her. Oh, she's beautiful. May 13th, 1778, Wednesday. We heard today that a girl with shorn hair was seen at one of the hospitals working as a nurse. Mr. Smith and Papa left immediately to find her, and everyone is praying that it is Lucy. All day I worry if I should tell where Lucy really is, and worry to myself so much more that I got a terrible stomachache. Reverend Curry came for supper, but I stayed in my bed listening through the floor cracks. He is a drummer boy, was given 50 lashes for trading shirts with a British soldier. How this is discovered he didn't say. Also, a soldier was given 200 lashes after he was caught running away from his commanding officer. Reverend Curry asked our prayers for the great number of soldiers who are sick. Many are dying of the pox and other infections. They are being buried naked so that their clothes can be passed on to others in need. May 14th, 1778, Thursday. The girl with shorn hair was not Lucy, which I knew, and it wouldn't be. At breakfast we prayed for her and for the soldiers. I silently asked God to show me what to do. There are Indians in camp, Oneidas and Tuscaroras. I saw them walk along the road towards headquarters, dressed in curious assortment of deerskin leggings and soldier coats, feather ornaments, and tricorns. They have volunteered to help General Washington. I want to see the Indians, Sally demanded. Up close, please. It was fearful, but Papa said not to be. There are Mohicans and Stockbridge Indians already serving the brigades from Massachusetts to Connecticut, Abby, and they are as loyal as any of the other men. Still, I stayed home. 2 hours later, Sally burst in the front door. Abby, I saw one. He had tattoos on his arm and face, and guess what he did? What? He walked into Mrs. Washington's kitchen. There was a hot roast beef on the table, and he grabbed a chunk of it with his fingers and thumb, and he twisted it out, and he walked to the front door right past me, and he began to eat and drip grease all over the floor. Abby, I saw an Indian, and I feared not. Sally was now in Mamma's room telling her adventure to Helen and Elizabeth. When I saw how tenderly Helen's hands hold her new little daughter, I wonder if I must go now to Mrs. Smith. How she must ache for Lucy. May 17th, 1778, Sunday. Baby Olivia is now 7 days old and is so warm and pleasant out, Helen brought her to church. Mrs. Hughes told us afterward that there was another theatrical production at the Bakehouse last Monday, and the audience was most lively. The play was Cato. I wish I could go see the next one, but no children are allowed. May 18th, 1778, Monday. Wash day. We put Olivia on the cradle and Johnny in the pen, which makes him mad. He hollers and bangs his spoon against the wood. I carried him outside so he could crawl in the grass while we hung the wash. I turned my back on him for just a moment, and when I looked down, here he was coming from the middle of the road, and horses were coming. Johnny, thou art too little to play here, I scolded as I lifted him onto my hip. His mouth turned down, and he let out such a wail, Papa came over. Papa clapped his hands and set Johnny on his shoulders for a bumpety ride. Soon he started laughing, and I was able to finish with the clothesline. At sunset, I hurried down the lane to the Smith cottage. I had made up my mind. In a quick breath, I told them Lucy is safe, and she shall return when her hair has grown to her shoulders. Mrs. Smith wept with relief, and her husband wiped his own cheek. Thank you, Abigail, he said. After supper, I wrote a letter to Lucy saying I could no longer bear to see her parents' sorrow. But they know not where you stay, I wrote. And now I shan't tell a soul. May 19th, 1778, Tuesday. General Lafayette and some of our troops are marching towards Germantown. They crossed the Schuylkill and Swede Ford last night about midnight. Papa said 100 Indians came too, and they were all camped at Burton Hill, 12 miles from Philadelphia. He said there may or may not be a battle. General Washington says from now on the soldiers are free on Fridays and they don't have to drill. This is because the streams are warm enough to wash clothes and to bathe, but they must stay in the water no longer than 10 minutes so they do not get a chill. Oni came to say Mrs. Washington would enjoy the company of one of us to visit some hospitals at the southern edge of camp. Elizabeth refuses to go any more. Helen has a baby to care for, and 3 Potter girls have not been vaccinated for the pox. We were last year. Now that I'm ready to go to bed, and I'm remembering the last time I visited sick soldiers with Mrs. Washington, I'm sorry I said yes. May 20th, 1778, Wednesday. A lieutenant drove us in the wagon south along the Gulf Road to the Quaker meeting house. There were cots from one end to the other end of the room. The stench was worse than the latrine, and there was a sharp odor I could not recognize. To keep from gagging, I covered my mouth and nose with my shawl. Why the windows and doors were not open to let in fresh air, I do not know. I followed Mrs. Washington, and she worked her way down the crowded rows talking to the soldiers who were awake and praying with them. She drew not away from the smells or the sight of amputated feet. In a corner of the room, a doctor was giving inoculations for the pox. One soldier whose cheeks were covered with sores tossed in his bed in a fever, moaning and crying out. He was shivering, even with a blanket over him. The doctor took a feather, and with the sharp end of the quill he scooped it into one of the man's oozing pocks, and then he turned and waited to a waiting soldier who had his sleeve rolled up and a fresh cut on his arm from the doctor's penknife. I was sickened watching. Into the fresh cut the doctor dabbed a bit of the goo and said, "There you go, friend. That shall soon have a fever, but not worry. No more die from the disease than the vaccination." This was repeated with 9 soldiers who'd been waiting outside in the sunshine. When we climbed up to the wagon seat, we saw a graveyard along the lane. 2 men were finishing digging a grave. Beside them lay the thin shape of a body rolled into a blanket. Not a word, the men lifted, then dropped the body naked into the grave, each holding an edge of the blanket, while one shoving dirt and the other carrying the blanket to the hospital and handed it through the door. Our wagon dipped into a gully, and as soon as it rose again over a hill, I turned around. I could see through a window that the blanket was being spread over one of the sick men. I glanced back at the cemetery. "Why are there no names on the graves?" I asked Mrs. Washington. She smiled. Sunlight was on her face, and she closed her eyes to enjoy the warmth. "My dear, it is one of those puzzles. Quakers, God bless them, are against war. They do not honor soldiers, so that is why their graves are marked not." May 21st, 1778, Thursday. Elizabeth and I were with Papa at the north end of our orchards, trimming branches that had broken into the wind last month. A coach passed us, and its horse at high trot with the coachman riding above the rear wheel. Sally was already running from the house, barefoot still, as Papa has no time to make her shoes. Papa laughed and said, "Go on, girls." We, too, ran with Sally. When we saw the very plump lady stepping down from the coach with a tiny infant in her arms, we cried, "Hello, Mrs. Knox." She waved and called us over to look at her new baby. A handsome soldier inside the coach helped her down, then stepped out with a cane. He wore high-heeled boots and was limping quite a bit. He took Mrs. Knox's elbow to guide her into headquarters. "Girls," she said to us, "this is Mr. Benedict Arnold, my official escort. We would like to take turns holding the baby when we get inside." Sally went first, sitting on the stool by the kitchen hearth. Mrs. Washington cooed and fussed over the tiny thing, and not until we were home did I realize no one said that if it was a boy or a girl, or what its name was. Maybe with 13 children, it doesn't matter. If it were my baby, I would name it Baker Dozen Knox. While Elizabeth held the baby, we could hear Benedict Arnold in the parlor talking to General Washington. He was describing his horrible wound from the Saratoga campaign 7 months ago, and how he is now only able to hobble with great pain. While I held the baby, only for a quick moment, Mrs. Washington told us there will be no more plays at the bakehouse. "Can you imagine," she said, "of all the things Congress has to worry about, and they pass a silly resolution. This is what it says." She pulled a piece of parchment from her apron pocket, unfolded it, and held it at arm's length to read. "Any person holding an office under the United States who shall attend a theatrical performance shall be dismissed from service." Mrs. Washington handed the page to Mrs. Knox so she could read it herself and said, "Sometimes government has the most ridiculous notions." May 25th, 1778, Monday. When Elizabeth and I arrived at headquarters to pick up the laundry, there were several ladies dressed in their best, saying farewell to one another. Billy Lee told us there's soon to be a battle, so the wives are going home. "Battle? Oh, not here, miss. General Washington will take his soldiers somewhere else to fight the redcoats. Don't you worry, not here, no sir." May 26, 1778, Tuesday. Elizabeth and I were putting clean linens on our beds when Sally stomped upstairs, excited and out of breath. "A soldier is here asking for thee, Beth. Hurry." I looked at my older sister and could see her eyes brighten. "Is it Pierre?" she whispered. He said not. Sally was already hurrying down, making a lot of noise for someone with bare feet. Elizabeth smoothed her skirts. She smiled tenderly at me before turning towards the stairs. The soldier standing by the hearth looked proud in his uniform, white stirrups over new shoes, a tricorn under his arm, a handsome coat. When he smiled at her, I saw his top teeth were missing. I knew the handsome coat was the one made by Elizabeth. I could not see her face. "Yes," she said softly. We all dared not to breathe. Helen was in the rocker, with Johnny on her lap, Mama at the fire. Papa was sewing a piece of leather. Sally stared at the soldier, then said, "Canst thou do this?" She struck her tongue out through the space where the 2 new teeth were barely showing. "Look!" But she spit by mistake, and we were all in one voice, "Sally!" The soldier laughed and reached over to pat her head. "I just came by to thank you, Miss Elizabeth Ann, for making me a coat. No one ever done such a nice thing for me, ever. Thank you, miss. I'll be going now." He shook Papa's hand, smiled again at Elizabeth, and stepped outside. "Mister," called Sally, "what is thy name?" "Ben," he said. "Ben Valentine, 2nd Pennsylvania Brigade." May 27, 1778, Wednesday. The soldiers who camped with General Lafayette outside Philadelphia a few days ago returned this morning in a drizzle. No shots were fired. Papa said it was just a drill. It rained all day and was cold enough to wear our wool stockings. Elizabeth was gloomy. "I wish I had been kinder to Ben Valentine," she told me in the barn while we milked Brownie. "Thou hast not been mean to him, Beth." "No, but I could have afforded him some tea. He was a good to come by. Was he not, Abby?" "Ah, but I'm no longer jealous of Elizabeth. She is much prettier than I, but she is not perfect. Today I think she's even a bit heart-sore." May 28th, 1778, Thursday. Rain and wind. May 31st, 1778, Sunday. It has been dark and rainy for 5 days. We have cold, so we all stayed in. Papa led us in prayers and hymns instead of taking us to church. We can see that the soldiers are also inside. The valley is quiet, with chimney smoke coming from the huts. Johnny kept us amused by his new trick he's learned. He pops his lips. Also, he can now climb to the top of the stairs. He stays on his stomach and tries to crawl down backwards, but twice he's bumped his chin and cries so loud we carried him back to the rug. Papa made a gate at the bottom of the stairs from one of the cupboard doors, so now Johnny must find something else to do. Sally keeps asking me to tell more about Lucy. Do not worry, Sally. I promise she's safe. June 1st, 1778, Monday. The roads are muddy again, but now the sun has returned, warmer than before. The soldiers practice until sundown, so we are hearing cannons and muskets fired all day. Papa said General Washington is getting ready to move the army to battle, but nearly 4,000 must stay behind. Those are sick and crippled. Because the air is warm, there is such a terrible stench as we ride to the edge of the camp. Dead horses need to be buried. Papa said 1,500 have died. At night we hear crows and owls fly from their nests in the dark hillsides to pick at the carcasses and other butchered animals. Wash day. June 2nd, 1778, Tuesday. We took Johnny to the creek after delivering the laundry to headquarters. I hailed him while he kicked his chubby legs in the water and shrieked. He is 6 months old and will stand up and take a step if someone holds his arm. In his mouth, on his bottom goom, is a tiny white bulge where a tooth is trying to grow. I like to hug him and twirl him over the stream so his feet skim the water. When he laughs, I'm so thankful he's alive, our first brother to make it through the winter. I find myself more patient with Sally because my worry for Johnny has passed. June 3rd, 1778, Wednesday. Reverend Curry delivered a letter for Mama. She sat at the table where there's light from our window and carefully broke the seal. Her eyes fell to the signature. "It's from Philadelphia, from your Auntie Haney," she said. I watched Mama's face as she read silently. Finally she looked up. "Girls, ye have a new cousin. His name is Matthew Robert, and all is well. Bless Haney, she's now got 6 little ones. My goodness. But here's the best part. Listen. The baby is ever so tiny and needs constant attention, as do the 5 other. I thank God for your friend Lucy is here to help, for I know not how I would rest otherwise." All heads turned to me as Mama continued to read. "Lucy has asked me to relay her whereabouts to you. She is terribly quiet, and I worry about her cough and lack of appetite. She was several days without food or shelter while making her way here, hiding in the forest from the soldiers. Lucy begged to stay with us until her hair has grown, but she is too full of shame to face her parents otherwise. I pray for her mother's sake that her hair grows quickly. Your loving sister, Haney." "Why did she go all the way to Philadelphia?" Mama asked me. I took a deep breath. Lucy knew Haney would not turn her away, for they became fast friends when we visited here in January. She knew she would be safe. Here I burst into tears, finally free of Lucy's secret. Mama put her arms around me. "It's all right, dear." June 4, 1778, Thursday. I was so happy yesterday, but I'm not happy today. We saw with our own eyes a soldier being hanged. We happened along the road, and just as the horse bolted from under the tree and the poor man kicked and struggled, his hands were tied behind his back, but he managed to free one hand and try to grab the noose. I burst into sobs. Elizabeth did too. Oh, it was horrible, horrible. The poor man. Talk on the road was that he was a spy and that one of his friends shall be hanged tomorrow. I hate the army. I want them to leave. June 7th, 1778, Sunday. Beautiful drive to church. Daisies, white and yellow, are in bloom along the road and up the hillsides. We are a large family now, with Helen and baby and Olivia, Mama and Papa, Elizabeth, Sally, and I, and our wiggly Johnny. An announcement from the pulpit made us all break into cheers, something I have not heard before in church. The British have released 6 patriots from the Walnut Street jail in Philadelphia. They are reasonably fair health, and they shall return to Valley Forge tomorrow. The name that made me want to cry for joy was this one, Mr. William Fitzgerald. June 8, 1778, Monday. Mrs. Fitzgerald was standing on the road looking south when we passed her on our way to pick up the wash from Washington headquarters. With her were 3 little boys standing straight, their faces clean and hair combed. They were about 5, 6, and 7 years old, and the sight of them made my heart squeeze tight. How brave she was to stand there ready to meet her husband, to give him the tragic news about their 5 older sons. She seemed a brave woman now that she knew she must be brave. When Buttercup pulled the wagon around the bend and out of sight, I broke down weeping, heavy sobs that would not stop. I felt heart-sore for Mrs. Fitzgerald, but thrilled her husband was safe. I felt sad also for hating Tom, that he had not had a chance to grow up and be the good man his father was. I'm very blue. June 9th, 1778, Tuesday. I am even more heart-sore than yesterday. Mrs. Washington left a few hours ago. She's traveling back to Mount Vernon, and I shall probably never see her again. Elizabeth and I returned the wash about 9:30 this morning. Oni and Billy Lee were packing trunks, and the other servants were up and down the stairs with things. The kitchen smelled of fresh apple pie and coffee, and several officers, I remember not their names, were talking with General Washington in the front room. Billy Lee said to us, "Lady Washington will be down soon after her devotions, missus. Then you can say goodbye." But I wanted not to say goodbye. So much kindness had come from her kitchen and her words. The long, cold winter had not seemed so lonesome because of her. Dear girls. We turned to see her coming down the stairs. She wore a dress of blue muslin with the tiny white buttons up each sleeve. She seemed beautiful to me, though I remember how plain I thought she was at first. We've known her just 4 months, and I can say she is the most cheerful, loving person I've ever met. Never did I hear her say a cruel word or complain about her surroundings. Mama said at Mount Vernon Mrs. Washington has more than 300 slaves in a luxurious mansion. We are not of her social class, and we had little to offer her, yet she welcomed us as friends. She gave us a small basket as we curtsied out the door. Inside ye shall find a little something for your mother and yourselves too. God bless ye, dear girls. We hurried home. Mama put the basket on the table and removed the cloth. Inside was a small leather pouch that jingled with coins. She peeked inside and read the attached note. 40 shillings per month for headquarters laundry, in addition to 4 shillings per dozen piece for Mrs. Washington. Why, there must be a fortune here, my goodness. And what's this? Mama lifted out a small stack of handkerchiefs tied with a red satin ribbon. They were cotton trimmed with lace, folded neatly. There were 10, 2 for each of us, and with them was this note. With fond wishes to Mrs. Stewart, Elizabeth, Abigail, Sally, and Helen Kern. We spent just a brief time together, but I shall always remember ye. Martha Washington. June 10th, 1778, Wednesday. The days are warm and drowsy. We made soap with beet juice so it would turn pink, and then we scented it with lavender. Helen and Sally gathered the flowers from along the creek, then crushed the petals into a sweet-smelling oil. After mixing, we poured it into our wooden mold that we'd lined with a damp cloth. It must set 24 hours. By noon the soap was dry, and we cut it into cakes with wire. This is the most pleasant chore of them all. We boiled more lard, and this time added carrot juice to make it yellowish, and crushed rosemary leaves for perfume. Tomorrow, Sally wants us to use spinach for green, then added rose petals for scent. My opinion of green soap is this. It looks like something from the bottom of our well, but I did not want to hurt Sally's feelings, so I kept this to myself. My favorite is pink with a rosemary fragrance. What a luxury to have soap. I appreciate my bath even more, knowing our soldiers shan't see their own homes for weeks to come. June 12, 1778, Friday. Mama says the best thing about the army leaving soon is that there shall be no more drums and whistles at 5 o'clock in the morning. I shall be glad to see no more hangings. Cannons and muskets still fire throughout the day. Papa made a new butter churn. It hangs in the kitchen by a rafter by the front door. Every time one of us walks by, we push it to swing. Sally finds this most amusing, and because she's bossy, she has assigned us each a task. I set aside the cream from Brownie's milk. Helen pours it to the top of the churn. Elizabeth corks it, then Sally gets to swing the barrel first. She pushed it so hard, though, it banged on the wall. Papa has now rehung it further into the room and raised it several inches so he won't bump our heads. He gave Sally a stick so she can reach it. June 13th, 1778, Saturday. We bathed today at the stream. Johnny thinks he can swim. He crawls fast from the bank across the narrow sandy beach, then into the water. He cries when his head goes under water or when the current tries to carry him away. We must watch him every moment. Next week we'll leave him home with Mama so we can swim without worrying about him. June 15th, 1778, Monday. Our wash dries fast in the sun and the breeze. The grass is wonderful under our bare feet. Sally stepped on a wasp and it kept stinging her and even crawled up her ankle to sting her there too, several times. How she wailed. Papa carried her inside where Mama soothed baking soda on the bites. All in an instant, Sally stopped crying. That is how fast soda works. Mama said if it happens again when we're out in the field, use mud. Tomorrow and Wednesday we'll make our candles, enough to last throughout next winter. When I carry mine upstairs, I look to a snowy window. I shall remember our soldiers. I shall remember to complain not about being cold or having unpleasant chores. June 18th, 1778, Thursday. Riders galloped through Valley Forge early this morning crying out, "The British are leaving Philadelphia." Where they are going, Papa knows not. Moments later, our soldiers began forming ranks. The generals are on horseback, and we've seen Baron von Steuben riding next to General Washington. Tents outside, camps are coming down as it's warm enough to sleep without shelter, and there is much shouting of orders and busyness. June 19th, 1778, Friday. We woke at 5 o'clock this morning to a drum beat and a quick step. We hurriedly dressed. Mama held Johnny, Helen carried Olivia on her shawl, and we ran to the road. It was dark, save for a few distant torches. "The army is leaving," said Papa. "God bless them, and God bless America." By noon the huts were deserted, the valley was quiet. We could see the camp followers struggling out with hand-carried belongings and a noisy assortment of children and dogs. Papa rode into the encampment with Mr. Porter and Mr. Adams. "It's a mess," they said when they returned. "It'll take weeks to bury the garbage and dead animals." Before Mrs. Hughes could move back into her house, Mama and us girls went to clean. What a sight! All I can say is there are many muddy boots that went in and out, and many chairs and tables that banged against the walls and scraped the floors. The entire house needs paint. And I suspect Mrs. Hughes will be disappointed the officers used her parlor to powder their hair and wigs, for the walls are covered with white dust. I think a respectable home should have its own little powder room with looking-glass combs, etc., for neatness. Mrs. Adams bought 2 of her roosters to clean the chimneys. Her husband climbed onto the roof and into each cold chimney, and he dropped one of the birds. They flapped their wings frantically, brushing the stone inside. The chunks of soot began raining down. After a few minutes they were so tired they dropped into the empty hearth. The birds did not die, but they looked like they wished to. I suspected the Adamses will have a roast chicken for supper tonight. June 20th, 1778, Saturday. A hush has fallen over the valley. I've forgotten how quiet it used to be and how much I loved the stillness. Where the army has marched to, we not know. Every meal Papa leads us in prayer for the safety of our soldiers and victory for General Washington. Just before sunset, a letter arrived for me. I quickly broke the seal. After reading, I did not throw it into the fire, but I pasted it onto this page. Dear Abigail, I must tell you some surprising news. Yesterday I visited the wig maker. Remember his tiny shop next door to Auntie Haney? He said my hair was made into a beautiful wig for the wife of a general who wintered in Valley Forge. When I inquired who is she, he looked through his papers and showed me the order. Do you know, Abby, that the note was signed by Martha Washington herself? Now I can sleep again. Thank God my foolish mistake did not land my hair on the head of one of those plump British officers. How I miss you, Abby, and my own family as well. I shall soon be home. Your loving friend, Lucy. June 22nd, 1778, Monday. Papa had gone with the other men to reclaim their fences. All day they worked at tearing down huts and loading wagons with wood. The children combed the grassy fields for musket balls and for you to use for marbles. Mama says the flat ones she can make into buttons by drilling 2 holes in the center. Elizabeth and I walked to the schoolhouse. It's being used still as a hospital, which pleases me. Everywhere we are looked for signs of fresh graves. Papa said nearly 3,000 soldiers died this winter, and there was not even a battle. At supper, Papa poured each of us a toddy and held up his mug to toast. To our new army, he said. 6 months ago, we all had a bunch of volunteers from the 13 colonies, and now look at them. You saw them, girls. We have a real continental army now, ready to send the redcoats back to King George. Hip hooray. May God bless every man. June 30th, 1778, Tuesday. The sun is hot. I saw Elizabeth sitting under a big oak tree writing a letter against her knees. Her ink jug was burrowed in the dirt beside her so it wouldn't tip over. I sat in the shade and leaned against the trunk so I could spy at her paper. She covered it with her hands, and then turned to me with a laugh. Since thou must know, little sister, I'm writing to Ben Valentine. Why? Abby, he was kind and gentle and appreciated my coat, even though I had sewn it with selfish motives. I'm writing to tell him I shall pray every day for his safety and well-being, and when the war is over, I shall cook him dinner. I knew not what to think, so I said something silly. Well, then, why did thee not also write a letter to Azor? Elizabeth laughed again. Oh, Abby. June 26, 1778, Friday. This has been the hottest summer I remember. The nights are so steamy we sleep on cots outside, but the mosquitoes are vicious. They do not bother us if we stay in with the doors and windows fastened, but then the heat is so heavy we cannot sleep. So Mama has taken to rubbing laurel leaves and mint on our faces, hands, and necks, and having us sleep in long-sleeved dresses with cotton leggings. This way we can lie on our cots and stare at the sky. The stars are so bright we can see the dark hillsides and the shadow of bats as they fly about. At night there is a faraway murmur from the creek. I think about Mrs. Washington. Somehow I feel not so lonesome for her, knowing that she may be wearing Lucy's beautiful brown hair. I'm beginning to believe that unpleasant events often work together for good, like a coat of many colors. June 29, 1778, Monday. Criers rode through Valley Forge this morning with news of a battle yesterday near Monmouth Courthouse. While our army fought the British, General Washington rode back and forth among the ranks of his soldiers until his horse dropped dead from exhaustion. At sunset, both armies stopped fighting so they could rest. Then after midnight, the enemy snuck away. We not know how many of our soldiers were wounded or killed, but we worry for them. We are like family to us now. Elizabeth must wait patiently for word about Ben Valentine. I watched her wait, and I puzzled how it happened that strangers from last winter had become so dear. June 30th, 1778, Tuesday. More news about the battle of Monmouth. 3 women stepped in to help with cannons after their husbands fainted from the heat. It has been the hottest June in memory, and even some of the horses collapsed. Other news pleased me. General Charles Lee was stripped of his command by General Washington because he disobeyed orders and retreated in haste. Papa said bravo. The man isn't a coward, an embarrassment to the patriots. Much pie making, July 3rd, 1778, Friday. Much pie making and visiting between the farms to borrow eggs, flour, sugar, bacon, and so forth. We are all very much glad to replenish our larders and not worry about thieves. Although if our soldiers should again be in need, I think we shall be one of the first to share. Tomorrow is the celebration for Independence Day. It has been 2 years since the Declaration was signed, and even though the British shan't leave us alone, we shall still have a party. Papa sawed our front and back doors in half, then rehung them so we can latch the lower half. With the tops open, we can catch a breeze, but Johnny can't crawl out. No wild animals can crawl in. July 4th, 1778, Saturday. It is late and I am tired. A breeze rose this afternoon that made the heat bearable. We are sleeping inside with windows open and the upper doors open. The breeze is pleasant and not allowing mosquitoes to land on us. I am dead sleepy, thus I shall be brief. Some of the soldiers, maypoles, were still in camp. So much of the day we children played and ran around them using ropes to swing on. There are still many trinkets to be found in the grass and dirt, even though cannonballs to play long bullet. At noon, blankets are spread in the shade along the bank of the Schuylkill. A finer barbecue I've not enjoyed. Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald butchered 2 of their cows to share with everyone, so grateful they are for all our prayers and concerns. There were also dozens of meat pies, fruit pies, and pumpkin pies passed around, cider and sweet lemonade, too. Baby Olivia is nearly 2 months old and is quite content. No wonder. There's always someone wanting to hold her and kiss her. Johnny looks like a giant next to her. He now pulls himself up and with one hand on a tree trunk walks around it in a circle, around and around. He's sore proud of himself. Colonel DeWeese gave a patriotic speech, but I did not listen. It was hot and I wanted to play in the stream. Tomorrow I shall have to ask Mama for more paper to sew together so I can keep writing my journal. I want to record every word we hear about our army. Papa says the war might continue many more months, but he's not worried. He has so much confidence in General Washington and our newly trained soldiers that he says we shall beat the British for sure. The crickets are loud tonight, and there is an owl nesting in our barn. When he flies out to do his night hunting, he passes through our window, his wings like a whisper. One more thought before I blow out my candle. I do hope Ben Valentine receives Elizabeth's letter. This is the end of The Winter of Red Snow, the Revolutionary War Diary of Abigail Jane Stewart, from Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 1777. Epilogue. During the Battle of Monmouth, Ben Valentine was shot in the left wrist. His arm was amputated on the field, and then he was sent to Philadelphia to recover. Over the weeks, Elizabeth visited him. A romance developed, and they were married in the summer of 1779. 2 summers later, at the age of 15, Abigail married a blacksmith named Willie Campbell. Another wedding took place at this time. A young widow, Helen Kern, married Daniel Kern, her deceased husband's brother, so she remained Mrs. Kern. They eventually had 5 children together. In 1787, the Valentines and Campbells, the Stewarts and the Kerns, moved west to a homestead in the Ohio Valley River. Abigail and Willie had 9 children. Their daughter, Hannah, became the first woman doctor in Phillips County. The 3 sons became lawyers. One moved to Washington City to be President Thomas Jefferson's personal counsel. Abigail died in 1823 at the age of 57 after being thrown from her horse. Willie died 2 years later, some say from grief. Elizabeth and Ben had 4 daughters who died in infancy, but their sons Paul and Nathaniel grew up to be explorers. Paul helped map the Missouri River and surrounding territory. He was good friends with Daniel Boone. At the age of 13, Nathaniel ventured to Boston and signed on as a cabin boy aboard a ship, Otter, captained by the legendary China trader Ebenezer Dorr, Jr. They sailed into Monterey Bay in October of 1796, the first American vessel to anchor in a California port. Elizabeth and Ben died together when their house caught fire in 1825. Life in America in 1777. Historical note. The American Revolution, also known as the War for Independence, was fought between 1775 and 1783. For the first time in history, the 13 American colonies banded together as a nation so that they could fight against Britain and achieve their own independence. Over the years, Britain and their ruler, King George III, had given the colonies a lot of freedom to govern themselves by allowing each colony to have its own legislature. In return, the colonies were given the protection of the British Empire and its famous Royal Navy. But then in 1764, Britain imposed the Sugar Act, and a year later the Stamp Act on the colonies. These acts forced Americans to pay very high taxes on sugar, legal documents, newspapers, and other items being imported into the colonies. Since the colonies had not been consulted about this, there were many riots and protests. This was taxation without representation, and the colonists had no intention of cooperating. In 1767's Britain Parliament passed the Townshend Acts, which placed outrageously high taxes on items such as paper, glass, paint, and tea. The colonies continued to protest and tried to boycott British products. Finally, in late 1773, some rebellious citizens in Boston crept into a British supply ship in Boston Harbor. They found more than 300 chests of tea and dumped them into the water. Britain was furious about this and began to pass even more punitive laws, which the colonists described as intolerable acts. For many years, the colonies had acted like 13 little countries, but now it was time to work together. In 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia with representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies. They agreed to remain under British authority, but decided that they wanted the right to create their own laws and taxes without British interference. They also agreed to ban most imported products from Britain. Britain's response to this was to bring troops, the Redcoats, into the colonies. While the colonies had no army of their own, small local volunteer groups began to form militias so that they could be able to defend themselves. Then, one night in April 1775, British troops were ordered to march from Boston out to Concord, Massachusetts, where they were planning to arrest rebel leaders and seize weapons and ammunition. That was the night Paul Revere crossed Boston Harbor and took his famous ride on horseback through the nearby towns, shouting and warning to one and all. When the Redcoats arrived in Lexington, the rebels, also known as the Patriots, were there to greet them. Nobody knows who fired the first shot, but it is called the shot heard around the world. The rebels end up chasing the Redcoats all the way back to Boston. Considering how many thousands of shots were fired that day, surprisingly few people were killed, but the war had now begun. A few weeks later, the Second Continental Congress met and decided to form a Continental Army. They selected a man who had been a great hero in the French and Indian War to be their general. His name was George Washington. He had never run an army before, but he turned out to be a born leader. Early in 1776, a writer named Thomas Paine published a pamphlet titled Common Sense. In it, Paine described the terrible tyranny King George III was forcing on the colonies and called for complete independence. The Continental Congress agreed. They appointed a small committee to draft some resolutions for the colonies, now to be described as the states. 3 of the 5 men on the committee were Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams. It was primarily Jefferson who wrote a document called the Declaration of Independence, and the Congress voted it into law on July 4th, 1776. There seemed to be very little chance that these tiny United States could defeat the great British Empire. Britain had a population of 8 million people, a thriving economy, and the finest naval and armed forces in the world. The total population in colonies was only 2.5 million, and 500,000 of these citizens were still pledging allegiance to King George. They were called Loyalists, or Tories, and they refused to help the Patriots in the war against Britain. There was also 500,000 slaves who were not allowed to fight, and 200,000 more people who were neutralists and would not fight at all. The colonies were not only outnumbered, but they also had no army, no navy, and almost no factories to manufacture the weapons and other supplies they would need. The only advantage they did have was that Britain was 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean and would have a hard time supplying its own troops. Britain's goal in the war was to squash the rebellion and force the colonies back under British rule, while Americans' goal was to gain total freedom and independence. The first major skirmish was the Battle of Bunker Hill, which actually took place on a nearby Breed's Hill in Boston. Neither side won. The British should have easily defeated the small amateur militia, but because the undermanned Patriots fought so well, the British knew they were in for a difficult fight. The British decided that if they could capture New York and the Hudson River, they could cut the colonies in half. During the lengthy Battle of Long Island, British General Sir William Howe almost managed to do just that. He was able to chase General Washington and his untrained soldiers from Brooklyn Heights all the way to Pennsylvania, and probably could have defeated the colonists once and for all. But wars were fought very differently in the 1700s, and among other things, most armies took the winter off. Transportation was difficult under any circumstance, and the cold winter months made fighting almost impossible. Having succeeded sufficiently for the time being, Howe withdrew back to New York. However, while Howe's army was resting and the general was busy going to parties and enjoying his holiday season, George Washington led his troops on a sneak Christmas attack. Washington and his militia crossed the Delaware River in boats, surrounded the British fort in Trenton, New Jersey, and forced 1,000 soldiers inside to surrender. Washington and his troops escaped before General Howe's army could retaliate. The war continued in small, indecisive battles during 1777. The British were able to capture Philadelphia and won large battles at Fort Ticonderoga and Fort Edwards in New York. But only a few weeks later, the Americans forced over 5,000 British soldiers to surrender under Saratoga. It was the first genuine victory for the United States and the turning point of the war. France, which had remained neutral, now decided that the United States would ultimately prevail, and they agreed to become our allies. Throughout the rest of the war, they were often able to provide desperately needed supplies and financial assistance to the colonists. Without this help, the Americans might not have been able to hang on long enough to win the war. The winter of 1777 and 1778 is famous because Washington brought his troops to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania for the winter. Food and clothing were so scarce that as many as 4,000 soldiers, about a third of the army, were barefoot and starving. While this could have permanently destroyed the soldiers' willpower, these struggles ended up making them stronger. The troops spent the long, cold months being drilled and trained in military tactics. By the time spring arrived, the motley Continental Army had become a group of skilled professional soldiers. The war continued on for the next several years. Britain couldn't manage to win, and the Americans would not give up. Finally, in late 1781, with France's help, America won a critical victory at Yorktown, Virginia. They defeated British General Cornwallis, who was forced to surrender his entire British army of 8,000 men. It was the last real battle of the war. The next spring, peace talks began in Paris. Britain officially agreed to grant America its permanent independence and to withdraw all of its remaining troops from the country. America's victory was complete, and the Treaty of Paris was approved by the Continental Congress on April 15, 1783, and signed in September. It was almost exact 8 years after the shot heard around the world, and the 13 colonies had finally become a free and independent nation, the United States of America. The end. The Winter of Red Snow, a Revolutionary War Diary of Abigail Jane Stewart, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 1777. Thank you for listening.